Every case leaves a trace, a name, a date, a question that was never answered. This is Silent Shadows. Imagine being asked to attend a business appointment at an address you have never visited. You cross the city on a cold January evening, only to discover that the street does not exist. Then you return home and find your wife murdered. That was the story William Herbert Wallace told Liverpool police in 1931. The question that followed was simple, but it has never received a satisfactory answer. Was Wallace the intended victim of an elaborate trap? Or was the appointment his own invention? The victim was Julia Wallace, who lived with William at 29 Wolverton Street in Liverpool's Anfield district. Their home was a modest terraced house, one of many packed into long, orderly rows. William worked for the Prudential Assurance Company, collecting insurance premiums from customers around the city. He was also a keen chess player, a quiet intellectual with interests in chemistry, music, and botany, by most accounts. The Wallaces lived privately and did not attract much attention. On Monday, January 19, 1931, William attended a scheduled evening at the Liverpool Central Chess Club. The club met in the city cafe, where members played matches and discussed upcoming fixtures. When Wallace arrived, club captain Samuel Beattie told him that someone had telephoned earlier, asking to speak with him. Wallace had not yet been there, so Beattie took down a message. That message would become the foundation of the entire case. The caller gave the name R. M. Qualtrough. He said he wanted to discuss an insurance policy for his daughter and asked Wallace to visit him the following evening. The address was 25 Menlove Gardens East, and the proposed meeting time was around 7:30. Wallace appeared interested. A potential new policy meant new business after all. He wrote down the details and asked other club members whether they knew where the address was. None of them seemed certain. The name Qualtrough was unusual, but it was not completely unfamiliar to Wallace. He later said he had encountered a customer with that surname during his insurance work, although that person apparently had no connection to the message. Nothing about the call immediately suggested danger. It sounded like a routine business inquiry. Still, there was something oddly indirect about it. Why contact Wallace through a chess club rather than his office or home? That question would become much more important later. The following day, Tuesday, January 20th, William went about his normal work. According to his account, he told Julia about the appointment and planned his route toward the Menlove Gardens area, several miles from Wolverton Street. Liverpool was cold and dark by early evening. William left home and began a journey involving multiple tram rides. Investigators would later reconstruct that journey almost minute by minute, because the case against him depended on how quickly one man could move across the city. A local milk delivery boy was among the last known people to see Julia alive. He came to the Wallace home that evening and spoke briefly with her at the door. His recollection of the precise time became crucial, although, like many witness estimates, it was not perfectly fixed. William was either still at home or left shortly afterward. If he killed Julia, he had only a narrow opportunity to do it before reaching the trams where independent witnesses later remembered seeing him. Wallace traveled south toward Menlove Gardens and began searching for the address. There really were streets named Menlove Gardens North, Menlove Gardens South, and Menlove Gardens West. It curved around a central green in a prosperous residential neighborhood, but Wallace could find no Menlove Gardens East. He asked tram workers, residents, a newspaper seller, and eventually a police constable for directions. His repeated questions created a trail of witnesses who could confirm that he had genuinely appeared to be looking. Now here's where it gets strange. Wallace did not simply glance around and give up. He walked through the neighborhood, checked house numbers, and asked whether 25 Menlove Gardens East might be a newly built address or a local variation of another street name. He even visited a nearby house and asked whether anyone there knew a man named Qualtrough. No one did. Eventually he accepted what the street layout had been telling him all along. Menlove Gardens East did not exist. Wallace then made the return journey to Wolverton Street. He arrived at around 8:45 and tried the front door, but said it would not open. He went around to the back entrance and had difficulty there as well. Nearby, his neighbors John and Florence Johnston were preparing to leave their house. Wallace approached them and explained that he could not get inside. When he tried the back door again in their presence, however, it opened. The three entered the darkened house. Wallace moved from room to room, calling for Julia. Upstairs, there was no sign of her. Then he went into the front parlor, a room the couple did not regularly use. Julia was lying on the floor beside the fireplace. She had suffered devastating blows to the head. Blood marked the room, and part of William's raincoat was found beneath or around her body. Whatever had happened there had been sudden, violent, and confined to a very small space. Police were summoned, and the house became a crime scene. Investigators found that money had been removed from William's insurance collection box, which was kept in the kitchen, yet the apparent robbery looked strangely limited. Other items of value had not been taken, and there was no obvious sign that the house had been thoroughly searched. The amount missing was modest. That raised an immediate possibility. Perhaps the stolen money was genuine motive, or perhaps it had been removed to make murder look like robbery. there was another puzzle. The murder weapon was never conclusively identified. Investigators considered a heavy iron bar or fireplace implement, but nothing was recovered that could be definitively linked to Julia's wounds. A bar normally kept in the house was said to be missing, though accounts of the household objects were not always consistent. Without a weapon, without a clear forced entry, and without a witness who had seen a stranger arrive, suspicion began to turn toward the person who had discovered the body. William Wallace did not behave exactly as everyone expected a grieving husband to behave. Some officers found him controlled and emotionally distant, but behavior after a traumatic discovery is unreliable evidence. Wallace was reserved by temperament and he was also in poor health. Others thought he appeared genuinely shocked. The difficulty is that both interpretations can fit the same conduct. Calmness can suggest calculation, or it can be the mind's response to horror. Even so, investigators watched him closely from the beginning. Then detectives traced the Qualtrough call. It had been placed from a public telephone box only about 400 yards from the Wallace home. The caller had experienced difficulty connecting and contacted the operator, leaving a technical record that helped establish the source. This changed the direction of the investigation. Whoever created the false appointment had probably known where Wallace spent Monday evenings, known enough about his insurance work to sound convincing, and been close to Wolverton Street when the message was sent. Police concluded that William himself had made the call. Their theory was that he left home on Monday, used the nearby telephone box, and then continued to the chess club. By arriving after the call, he could receive the message in front of other members and make the appointment look independent. The next evening he could kill Julia, travel publicly toward the false address, and establish an alibi by asking conspicuous questions. It was an elegant theory, but elegance is not the same thing as proof, so let's back up a second. Could Wallace physically have made the call and still arrived at the chess club when witnesses said he did? The prosecution believed he could. The timing was tight but possible if the estimates lined up in the state's favor. The defense argued that the available tram times, walking distances, and witness recollections made the journey improbable. There was no recording of the caller's voice, and Samuel Beatty could not identify Wallace as the man he had heard over the telephone. The caller's voice was described as somewhat deep or gruff, but telephone sound quality in 1931 offered little certainty. Beatty knew Wallace personally. When later asked whether the voice had been his, he did not provide the firm identification the prosecution needed. Wallace also denied making the call. That left the authorities with location and opportunity, but no direct evidence. No one had seen him inside the telephone box, and no physical trace connected him to the instrument. The Tuesday timeline was even more controversial. To commit the murder, Wallace had to attack Julia after the milk boy's visit, clean himself sufficiently to leave without visible blood, conceal or dispose of the weapon, and reach the tram system in time to be noticed on his journey. The available window may have been only a matter of minutes. Prosecutors said a planned attack could have been carried out quickly. The defense said the compressed sequence bordered on the impossible. Blood evidence created further uncertainty. Julia's injuries would likely have produced substantial spatter, yet no convincing blood traces were found on the clothes Wallace wore during his journey. The prosecution suggested the raincoat discovered with Julia's body might have been used as protection during the attack, but that explanation introduced its own problems. How exactly had Wallace worn or positioned it? Could it have shielded him completely? And why leave behind an item so clearly associated with himself? Investigators also questioned whether Wallace had enough time to wash, change, and leave the house appearing normal. Witnesses on the trams did not report seeing blood on him or noticing unusual agitation. On the other hand, the killer may not have been heavily stained, and forensic reconstruction was far less developed than it is today. The scene could support competing narratives. That became a pattern throughout the case. Nearly every fact pointing toward guilt also allowed a plausible argument for innocence. Motive was another weakness. The Wallaces' marriage was private, and Julia's precise age and personal history have generated debate, but there was no clear evidence of an explosive domestic conflict. William did not appear to gain a large fortune from her death. Prosecutors implied that hidden resentment or marital strain could have driven him. Yet they could not demonstrate a specific event that triggered the killing. A lack of obvious motive does not prove innocence, of course, but it mattered in such a circumstantial case. Wallace was arrested and charged with Julia's murder. His trial opened in Liverpool in April of 1931. The prosecution presented the false appointment as an alibi constructed in advance. Wallace, they argued, had deliberately chosen a non-existent street name that sounded believable because the other three Menlove Gardens streets were real. His highly visible search was not evidence of innocence in their view. It was performance designed to make certain that strangers remembered him far from home. The defense focused on the clock. If Julia was alive when the milk boy visited, Wallace had very little time to kill her and still catch the tram. If the medical estimate placed death later, Wallace could not have been the attacker at all because witnesses had him miles away. Medical estimates of time of death were imprecise, however, particularly in a cold house. Both sides tried to use the same uncertainties, and the jury had to decide which sequence seemed more believable. There was no confession, no murder weapon had been found, no witness placed Wallace in the parlor during the relevant minutes, and no one identified him as the telephone caller. Even so, the circumstantial pattern proved persuasive to the jury. In late April, William Herbert Wallace was found guilty of murdering his wife and sentenced to death. He continued to insist that he was innocent. For a time, it appeared that the strange address had achieved exactly what prosecutors claimed it was designed to do, only imperfectly. But the case did not end with the verdict. Wallace appealed. And in May of 1931, the Court of Criminal Appeal took the unusual step of overturning the conviction. The court ruled that the jury's decision could not be supported by the weight of the evidence. This was not a declaration that Wallace had been proven innocent. It was a judgment that the prosecution had not established guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The death sentence was set aside, and Wallace walked free. The appeal left a difficult gap between legal innocence and historical certainty. Wallace returned to private life, but he remained under suspicion in the eyes of many people. His health deteriorated, and he died a little more than 2 years after Julia. He never changed his account of that evening. No second prosecution followed, and no other person was ever charged. Legally, the case had reached its end. As a mystery, though, it was only beginning to expand. Over the years, attention shifted toward possible alternative suspects. One frequently discussed name was Richard Gordon Parry, a younger man who had previously worked with Wallace and was familiar with aspects of his insurance business. Parry denied involvement and had an alibi that police examined. Later stories alleged that he had made incriminating remarks or possessed a bloodstained vehicle, but these claims emerged indirectly and could not be tested in court. Suspicion is not evidence, and Parry was never charged. Other theories suggest that someone known to Julia entered the house while Wallace was away. She may have admitted a visitor voluntarily, explaining the absence of obvious forced entry. A thief familiar with the collection box could have expected more money than was actually there. The false appointment would then have served to remove William from the house. But that theory still requires careful knowledge of his chess schedule. His occupation and the geography of Liverpool. The caller was not choosing details at random, and that brings us back to the voice on the telephone. If Wallace was innocent, the caller likely planned 2 evenings in sequence. First, deliver the message when Wallace would be at the chess club, then rely on him leaving Julia alone to chase an address that sounded real. If Wallace was guilty, the call was a sophisticated but risky attempt to manufacture distance. Either way, the plan depended on timing, local knowledge, and the confidence that one invented word, East, would be accepted without verification. There are details that may never be resolved. We do not know with certainty when Julia died, how her killer entered, what weapon was used, or why only the collection money disappeared. We do not know whether the raincoat was part of the attack or simply caught beneath her as she fell. And despite extensive investigation, we do not know who stood in that telephone box and asked for R.M. Qualtroff's message to be delivered. The murder of Julia Wallace remains compelling because it appears almost solvable. The route can be mapped, the tram journeys can be reconstructed, the witnesses can be placed along the streets, yet the closer the timeline is examined, the less stable it becomes. A few disputed minutes separate a carefully staged murder from a carefully staged trap. William Wallace was convicted, condemned, and then released because those minutes could not bear the weight placed upon them. Julia herself can become overshadowed by the puzzle, so it is worth returning to her. She was not merely the body waiting at the end of an impossible appointment. She was a woman in her own home, killed with extraordinary violence while carrying out an ordinary evening routine. Whoever created the Qualtroff message made her life part of a calculated sequence. The legal system failed to identify that person with certainty, and Julia's family never received a final answer. Nearly a century later, the central possibilities remain unchanged. William may have constructed an alibi and escaped execution only because his timing could not be proven. Or an unknown caller may have sent him across Liverpool while an accomplice thief or solitary killer approached Julia. Both stories require planning, both contain awkward details, neither explains everything. At 25 Menlove Gardens East there was no house, no client, and no appointment, but the journey to that non-existent address led directly into one of Britain's most enduring unsolved murders. If this case stayed with you, there are others waiting. Subscribe to Silent Shadows and walk with us into the next one.